My stepmother smiled at me the day of my father's funeral like she was already redecorating. I noticed it between the handshakes and the casserole dishes people kept bringing to the door. She stood near the fireplace in the living room, my father's living room, the one he'd built with his own hands in 1987, the one where I'd learned to walk and where I'd cried after every breakup and where I'd sat with him on Sunday mornings eating toast and not saying much because we didn't need to. She stood there, and she smiled, and she looked at the walls like she was measuring them. I told myself I was imagining things. I was 31 years old. My name is Claire. I'd moved back into that house 14 months before my father died. When his diagnosis came back, and the word aggressive appeared in the doctor's notes, and suddenly everything that had seemed important, my apartment in Columbus, my graphic design job, my almost relationship with a man named Derek who never quite committed, none of it seemed to matter anymore. I packed 2 suitcases, and I came home to Denton, Ohio, and I became my father's caregiver. My stepmother, Renee, had been in the picture for 9 years. She and my father married when I was 22, after my mother passed. I won't say I loved her. I won't say I hated her either. She was pleasant in the way that certain people are pleasant surfaces only, no depth to press against. She had 2 sons from her first marriage. Kyle, who was 35 and lived 40 minutes away in a suburb with a nice lawn, and a wife named Brittany who wore expensive athleisure and called everyone babe. And then there was Derek, different Derek, Renee's younger son, who was 28, and between jobs the way some people are, permanently between jobs. My father's name was Harold. He was 68 when he died. He had a wide, quiet face and enormous hands, and he made the best scrambled eggs I've ever eaten in my life. He called me kiddo until the very end, even when he could barely speak. He called me kiddo and he squeezed my hand. And then on a Tuesday morning in March he was gone. He left behind a house. The house sat on a little over an acre in a neighborhood that had gotten considerably more valuable in the last decade. I knew this because I'd watched the Zillow estimates creep upward during the 14 months I'd lived there. I knew the house. I knew every creak in the hallway floor, the second step that groaned, the bathroom window that only opened halfway. I knew the way the light came through the kitchen in the morning, and I knew which burner on the stove ran hot. I had spent 14 months making sure my father took his medication and got to his appointments and ate something even when the treatment made everything taste like metal. I had given up 14 months of my life without a single moment of resentment because he was my father, and I loved him. And that is what you do. I want to be precise about what those 14 months looked like, because I think people sometimes imagine caregiving as a kind of extended presence, just being there, keeping someone company. That wasn't what it was. It was learning to read the side effects chart for his medication and knowing which ones required a call to the oncologist and which ones could be managed at home. It was setting 3 alarms in the night because his pain medication schedule didn't align with any natural human sleep pattern. It was learning what foods he could tolerate in which weeks of treatment, and keeping a running note in my phone of what worked and what made things worse. It was calling his insurance company 17 times over a billing dispute for a procedure that should have been covered, staying on hold for 40 minutes at a stretch, and not stopping until it was resolved. It was being the person the hospice team called when they had questions, because I was the one who knew the answers. I don't say any of this for credit. I say it because I want the picture to be accurate. What I did not know until a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the funeral, was that my father had never updated his will. I found out from a man named Gerald, who was my father's attorney, and who had a patient face and the kind of voice that delivers difficult information without flinching. He called and asked if I could come to his office. I assumed it was paperwork. Estate administration. I wore a nice blouse. Gerald sat across from me and opened a folder and told me that my father's will, last updated in 2019, left the house and all primary assets to Renee, his surviving spouse. I sat very still. There's a provision, Gerald said carefully, that mentions you. A savings account, approximately $14,000, designated for Claire Mercer. $14,000. I had given up my apartment. I had turned down a job offer in March of the previous year because I couldn't leave. I had spent 14 months sleeping in my childhood bedroom and driving my father to chemotherapy and learning how to manage a feeding tube and talking to hospice nurses at 2 in the morning. I had done all of it without asking for anything, without expecting anything, because I assumed because he was my father that there was an understanding between us that didn't need to be spoken. Gerald was still talking. He was explaining something about Ohio estate law and surviving spousal rights. I heard maybe half of it. I drove home to the house that was no longer mine, and Renee was in the kitchen making tea, and she looked up when I came in, and she said, in a tone that was almost gentle, "Gerald called me too." "Okay," I said. "I want you to know I'm not going to rush you," she said. "I think a month is very fair. To find a place." "A month," I nodded. I went to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at the wall where I'd had a poster of the Pacific Ocean when I was 16, where you could still see the faint outline of the tape marks if you knew where to look. That night I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table after Renee had gone to bed and I made a list on a piece of paper. Not because I'm dramatic, because I needed to see things in front of me to understand them. My father had taught me that. "Write it down," he used to say. "Helps you see what's real." I wrote down what I had. The 14,000. Some savings of my own, not much. I hadn't been working full-time. The 2 suitcases I'd come home with. A car that was paid off. Skills that paid inconsistently. I wrote down what I'd given. 14 months. The job. The apartment I'd broken my lease, which had cost me. I wrote down the number of appointments I'd driven him to. I had records because I kept records. I had always been the kind of person who keeps records. Then I wrote down what didn't make sense. The will was from 2019. My father had been diagnosed in late 2022. There had been over a year between the diagnosis and his death. He had been cognitively sharp until almost the very end, sharp enough to do crosswords, sharp enough to argue with cable news, sharp enough to tell me detailed stories about his childhood in West Virginia that I'd never heard before. He had been sharp enough, I kept thinking, to update a document. Why hadn't he? I called Gerald the next morning and asked that question directly. There was a pause. "That's something I can't speak to," Gerald said. "What I can tell you is that he did come in to see me. In November of last year. November. 4 months before he died. When he was still coherent. When I was still driving him everywhere. Still managing everything." "Did he make any changes?" I asked. "I'm not able to discuss the specifics of what was or wasn't discussed without the relevant parties present," Gerald said. And then he paused again, longer this time. "Mercer, I'd encourage you to look carefully at any documents your father may have given you directly. Sometimes clients, particularly in his situation, they want to handle things quietly, outside of the formal process." I thanked him and hung up. I went to my father's study. Renee had already begun going through things. I could tell from the slight reorganization, a box near the door with some books in it. But she hadn't touched the locked drawer in the bottom right of his desk, because she didn't know about it. Because that drawer had existed since before Renee, since before my mother even got sick, and the key to it had lived on my father's keychain, along with his car key, and the little bottle opener my mother had given him as a joke on their first anniversary. I had the keychain. It had been in the bag of belongings the hospice nurse handed me. The drawer held 3 things. A photograph of me and my father at my college graduation. A letter my mother had written him before she died that I didn't read because it wasn't for me, and a white envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. There were 4 pages inside. The first was a handwritten letter. The others were documents, photocopies, signed and dated. My father wrote like he spoke. Straightforward, no decoration. He started by saying he was sorry. He said he knew he had left things complicated and he hadn't meant to, but he also hadn't known how to fix it without causing a war in the house while he was still in it, and he hadn't had the energy for a war. He said Renee was not a bad person, but she had pressures from her sons, particularly Kyle, and she was not strong enough to stand up to them. He said he had made mistakes, and the biggest one was waiting too long. Then he told me to look at the documents. The documents were a deed. A quitclaim deed, properly notarized, transferring the property at 412 Sycamore Trace, Denton, Ohio, the house, the acre, all of it to me. It was dated November 14th. It had been filed. I know because the 3rd page was the confirmation from the county recorder's office. I sat in that chair for a long time. Long enough that the light in the study changed from morning to early afternoon. I read the letter twice more. I looked at the notary stamp and the recorder's stamp and my father's signature, which was large and a little shaky but unmistakably his. I thought about what it must have cost him to do this quietly, to arrange a meeting with Gerald without mentioning it at home, to sit in a notary's office with his large, shaky hands and sign his name to something he knew would cause difficulty later but that he had decided was right regardless. My father was not a complicated man in most ways, but he understood something that I was only beginning to understand myself. That doing the correct thing and doing the easy thing are almost never the same action, and the only question is which one you can live with. Then I took a photograph of every page with my phone. Then I put the originals back in the envelope, and I put the envelope inside the waistband of my pants, under my shirt, because I needed to think before I did anything, and I needed those documents to be on my person while I thought. I understood, sitting there, why Gerald had said what he'd said. He'd known. He couldn't tell me directly, it was outside his role, but he'd known, and he'd pointed me toward the drawer in the only way he could. My father, in his quiet way, had tried to fix it. What he hadn't fixed was the situation I was currently in, which was that Renee believed she owned the house, and in approximately 27 days, she expected me to leave it. I spent 4 days doing nothing outwardly visible. I continued to help with things around the house because that was still my nature. I continued to be polite to Renee, who was polite back in her surface way. I researched. I called a real estate attorney named Patricia Okafor, whose name I found through a bar association directory, and who had a direct, no-nonsense phone manner that I immediately trusted. I told Patricia everything. She asked me to send the documents. 40 minutes later, she called me back. "The deed is valid," she said. "It was filed properly, it predates the will, and under Ohio law, real property transferred via deed during the decedent's lifetime is not part of the probate estate. The will is essentially irrelevant to this property." "So the house is mine," I said. "The house has been yours since November 14th, she said. "You simply didn't know it." She explained what would happen next. There was a process. It wasn't instant, but it was not complicated, and it was not in doubt. "What about Renee?" I asked. "She's a tenant," Patricia said. "At this point, without a lease agreement, she's essentially a tenant at will, which means you have rights regarding the property that she does not have." I asked Patricia to give me 1 week before she sent anything formally. She agreed. That week was strange. I was living in my own house, being told to prepare to leave it, knowing that I wasn't going to leave it, unable to say anything yet. I watched Renee walk through rooms and look at things. I watched her son Kyle come over on Saturday. He lived 40 minutes away but had been at the house 4 times since the funeral, and sit in my father's armchair and talk to his mother in a low voice while I made coffee in the kitchen and listened. Kyle thought the house should be sold. He had opinions about what it would get on the current market. He used the phrase "smart financial move" twice in the same sentence, which I noted, because it told me a great deal about what his interest in this situation actually was. He had never, in the 9 years his mother had been married to my father, shown particular interest in the house as a home. He had shown interest in it now as an asset. That distinction mattered to me. The day after Kyle's visit, Renee knocked on my bedroom door and said she needed to talk to me. We sat in the living room. She had a cup of tea. She held it with both hands in the way people do when they need something to hold. She told me that she wanted to be thoughtful about the transition. She said she knew this was hard. She said she hoped we could remain on good terms. She said the house was really too large for her alone, and she'd been thinking she might sell it and perhaps I could use the money from my father's savings to find something. She paused, something more suitable to my situation. "Something more suitable to my situation," I repeated. "I just mean," she said, "a house this size, and this neighborhood, with property values the way they are." She stopped. "I don't want this to be adversarial, Claire." "I don't want that either," I said. And I meant it. I had never wanted a war. My father had known I didn't want a war. It was partly why he'd handled things the way he had. "I'm glad," she said. She relaxed slightly. "Kyle thinks it would sell quickly. He knows someone in real estate who could." "I need to tell you something," I said. She stopped. I took a breath. I had practiced this part with Patricia on the phone, not the specific words, but the principle. Calm, factual, not unkind. My father had handled conflict the same way. "Write it down. See what's real." "My father transferred ownership of this property to me in November," I said. "Via quitclaim deed. It's been on file with the county recorder since November 14th. Renee was very still. "The house belongs to me," I said. "It has been mine, legally, since before he passed. I have a copy of the deed, the notarization, and the recorder's confirmation. My attorney also has copies. The silence in the living room was the particular kind of silence that follows information that reorganizes a person's understanding of their situation. I have only heard a silence like that a few times in my life. That's not possible, Renee said. Her voice was careful. Careful in the way of someone who is hoping that if they speak precisely enough, reality will be different from what they've just been told. I know it's not what you expected, I said. I didn't know about it either until recently. But it's the situation. She set down her tea. Her hands were very steady, which surprised me. Kyle should know about this, she said. That's your choice, I said. Kyle came over the following evening. He sat in the same armchair he'd sat in on Saturday, but differently this time forward in it, elbows on knees. He was a compact, confident man, Kyle, the kind who expected that his confidence would function as a form of persuasion. He had his mother's surface pleasantness dialed all the way down and something more direct underneath. He told me that he had spoken to a lawyer. I told him that was smart. He said that his lawyer had questions about the circumstances under which the deed was signed. He used the phrase undue influence. He said his father, and he called my father his father, which I noted had been in a compromised state and may have been manipulated. I let him finish. Then I told him that my father had been examined by 2 physicians in October of last year, both of whom had documented his cognitive capacity in writing, and that one of those examinations had been arranged specifically by Gerald, my father's attorney, in connection with the estate planning Gerald had assisted with in November. I told him that the notary who had witnessed the deed signing was also prepared to attest to my father's clarity of mind on that date. I told him that Patricia had all of this. Kyle looked at me for a long moment. He wasn't manipulated, I said quietly. He was a man who knew he was dying and who wanted to make sure his daughter was taken care of. That's all this is. You were living here, Kyle said. You had access to him. I was caring for him, I said. I drove him to 112 appointments in 14 months. I know that number because I kept a log. I gave up my job and my home to be here. I didn't do that to get a house. I did it because he was my father and he needed me. The room was very quiet. The house is mine, I said. I'm not asking anyone to leave immediately, but I need everyone to understand what the actual situation is. Kyle left without saying much. Renee stayed in her room for most of the following day. Patricia sent a formal letter at the end of that week. It was not aggressive. It outlined the legal ownership, referenced the recorded deed, noted the relevant Ohio statutes, and proposed a timeline for resolution. It also noted that, as the property owner, I had certain rights that took precedence over any expectations based on a will that, as it pertained to this property, was superseded by the earlier transfer. Kyle called Patricia directly. I know because Patricia told me, and because she said the conversation was brief. What followed was not a single dramatic confrontation. It was paperwork and phone calls and a mediation session where everyone sat in a conference room with Patricia and a mediator and discussed the situation with a flatness that would have looked to an outsider like the least emotional thing in the world, though I can tell you it was not. Renee had consulted her own attorney, a man named Fowler, who had the air of someone who had already assessed the situation and found his client's position to be weak, but was being paid to represent it anyway. Fowler raised the undue influence argument formally. Patricia provided the physician assessments, the notary's affidavit, and a timeline showing that my father had initiated the conversation with Gerald about estate planning in September, before his condition had declined significantly, and that the November deed signing had been the conclusion of a process that had begun months earlier, at his own instigation. The undue influence argument did not survive contact with the evidence. I remember sitting in that conference room while Fowler presented his position and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not satisfaction, but a kind of tiredness that went all the way down. I had not wanted to be in a conference room. I had not wanted any of this. I had wanted to grieve my father in the house where he had lived, quietly, without lawyers and mediators, and a man named Fowler presenting arguments he clearly didn't believe. I had wanted the simple version of things, which was that my father had loved me, and I had cared for him, and we had understood each other, and that the world would recognize those facts, without requiring me to document and defend them, in a beige room, with a rectangular table, and a pitcher of water that nobody touched. But the world doesn't always work that way. And so I sat in the beige room, and I let Patricia do her job, and eventually, it was done. 3 weeks after the mediation session, Fowler sent a letter that was, in its careful legal language, essentially a concession. Renee would need to make arrangements. Kyle's involvement in the matter concluded at this point, at least formally. I gave Renee 60 days. Patricia thought I should give 30. I gave 60, because she was not the villain of this story. She was someone who had believed something that turned out to be untrue, and she had lost her husband. And those are real things, regardless of everything else. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I want to be clear about that. I felt a bone-deep exhaustion and something underneath it that might have been, eventually, relief. The morning Renee moved out, she came and found me in the kitchen. I was making coffee. It was early and the light was coming in the way it always does in the morning, this particular long angle that has been the same my entire life. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "He loved you very much," she said. "I want you to know that I know that." I looked at her. She seemed smaller than she had in the months before. More real somehow. "I know," I said. "I knew that." She nodded once. She went to finish with her boxes. Kyle never spoke to me directly again. He sent one text, brief and formal, in the weeks after the mediation, that said something about hoping things would be settled fairly. I read it twice, and then I put my phone down and went to sit on the porch, where there was a hanging basket my father had put up 2 springs ago and still somehow had a dead fern in it that no one had gotten around to removing. And I looked at the front yard and the big oak at the edge of the property line, that my father had climbed as a child and told me about multiple times. And I breathed in the particular smell of Ohio in late spring, which is cut grass and damp soil and something else I don't have a word for, but that I have known my entire life. I stayed on that porch for a long time. There were things I had to do. There was the question of income, of getting back to work, of figuring out what the next version of my life looked like. There was the fern, which needed to be replaced. There was the second step in the hallway, still groaning, that my father had been meaning to fix for 3 years. There was a section of gutter on the north side of the house that I'd noticed pulling away from the fascia board 2 months ago and mentioned to no one because there had been more pressing things to mention. There was the garden bed along the back fence that my father had planted with peonies the spring before he got sick, and that had come back this year without anyone tending them. They had just come back on their own. The way peonies do? Pink and extravagant and completely indifferent to everything that had happened. I had stood at the kitchen window one morning and seen them blooming, and had to sit down on the floor because I wasn't expecting it, the force of it, how something could be so alive, and so completely his at the same time. I ordered a replacement fern plant online that evening. I watched it process on the screen and felt the particular sensation of doing a small, ordinary thing after a long period of extraordinary things. I also called my old employer in Columbus. Not to ask for my job back, that ship had sailed, but to ask if there was freelance work. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. I set up a small workspace in the corner of the living room, by the window that faced the oak tree, and I sat down at my laptop for the first time in what felt like years, and I did work that had nothing to do with medication schedules or insurance disputes or legal documents, and it felt strange and also, quietly, good. The house had always been mine. I had just needed to know it. What I understand now, fully, in a way I perhaps only half understood when I was sitting at that kitchen table at 2 a.m. making my list. What I understand is that my father didn't leave me the house as payment. He wasn't settling a debt. He knew I hadn't kept my log and driven to those appointments and learned to manage a feeding tube because I expected something in return. He knew that because he knew me. He'd had 31 years to understand the shape of who I was. He left me the house because it was mine in every way that mattered before it was mine on paper. Because some things are true before they're documented. Because he was, in his quiet, large-handed way, trying to make sure that the world's paperwork eventually matched up with its reality. The second step still groans. I've decided I might fix it myself. My father used to say that the house would teach you everything you needed to know about it if you paid attention long enough. I've been paying attention my whole life. I think I'm finally ready to learn the rest. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the one who showed up, the one who stayed, the one who gave everything and was told quietly that it didn't count, I want you to know that I see you. Leave me a comment below and tell me your story. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There are more stories coming. Stories about people who held on, who found the document in the drawer, who sat on the porch and breathed, and decided to stay. I'll be here.